Did medieval women really spend their lives locked away, powerless, and silenced by the church? Were they always seen as just trouble, daughters of Eve with no voice or influence? What if everything you thought you knew about women, faith, in the Middle Ages, from roughly 500 to 1500 CE, was missing some really big pieces of the story? Number 7. The church universally condemned female sexuality. Many stories paint a picture where the medieval church saw all female sexuality as a dangerous trap, a sinful allure, a pathway to damnation. It is often believed that the only acceptable state for women was virginity, and anything else, especially anything connected to the body, was condemned. This widespread idea suggests that the church imposed a strict, joyless view on women's physical lives, crushing any expression of their natural being. People sometimes imagine a world where the church only spoke of Eve's sin, linking it directly to the female form and its desires. This belief leads some to think that women were constantly shamed for their bodies, and that any form of intimacy was viewed with suspicion, even within marriage. The prevailing narrative can make it seem as if the church focused solely on controlling women's bodies and stripping them of any personal freedom in this area. Yet, a closer look at the deep and varied teachings and practices across the vast medieval period reveals a different, more intricate picture. While virginity was held in high regard, considered a path to spiritual purity and a way to imitate Mary, the mother of Christ, it was not the only honorable path. Marriage itself was a sacrament, a sacred bond established by God, according to Christian teaching. For married couples, intimacy was not universally condemned, it was understood as a natural part of the marital union, serving multiple purposes within that holy bond. Saint Augustine, a hugely important Christian thinker whose ideas influenced much of the Middle Ages, explored the purposes of marriage. He wrote about three goods of marriage: procreation, fidelity, and the sacrament itself. Within this framework, sexual intimacy was not merely tolerated but recognized as necessary for procreation, an act blessed by God. He also spoke of it as a means to avoid fornication, guiding desires within the sacred confines of marriage. Even later theologians, building on Augustine's ideas, affirmed the legitimacy of marital relations. So Peter Lombard, whose sentences became a standard textbook for theological students throughout the High Middle Ages, discussed marriage extensively. He described it as a remedy for sin and a means for procreation, thereby acknowledging the proper place of physical union within its bounds. The scholastic theologians, who spent countless hours debating and defining Christian doctrine, delved into these nuances. They carefully distinguished between sexual acts outside of marriage, which were sinful, and those within marriage, which were legitimate and even meritorious when done with the right intention. The penitentials, which were handbooks for confessors to guide people in confession and assign penance, also offer a window into how these ideas were applied in daily life. While they detailed sins related to sexual transgression, they also distinguished between various acts. They often focused on issues of lust and infidelity rather than condemning marital relations themselves. For instance, some penitentials might suggest penance for excessive indulgence or for seeking pleasure solely for its own sake, but they did not forbid marital intimacy entirely. Instead, they aimed to regulate it within the Church's moral framework. These documents often provided guidance on when marital acts were appropriate, such as outside of penitential seasons like Lent or on specific holy days. This nuanced approach shows a regulation of behavior rather than a blanket condemnation of physical expression within marriage. Take the example of Saints Louis IX and Marguerite of Provence, the king and queen of France in the 13th century. Though Louis was known for his piety and ascetic practices, their marriage was considered fruitful and legitimate by the church, producing 11 children. While we do not have intimate details of their personal lives, their relationship, as described by chroniclers like Jean de Joinville, was one of mutual respect and partnership within the confines of a royal marriage. The legitimacy of their children, key to the succession of the kingdom, was never questioned by the church on grounds of their parents' marital intimacy. This demonstrated how a deeply religious monarch and his queen fulfilled their sacramental duties. Furthermore, medieval legal texts, both secular and canon law, acknowledged marital rights for both spouses. The legal concept of dedum conjugal referred to the marital debt, the mutual obligation of spouses to render conjugal rights to each other. While complex and debated, this concept recognized a reciprocal right to sexual intimacy within marriage, not just for procreation, but also for the sake of companionship and mutual welfare. The Church's courts, which handled many cases related to marriage and family life, adjudicated disputes based on these principles. A spouse who refused their partner their conjugal rights without good reason could face legal consequences within the church's judicial system. This legal framework, shaped by theological thought, offered a regulated space for physical intimacy within the sacrament of marriage. The church's focus was often on channeling and sanctifying human desires rather than eradicating them entirely. They aimed to elevate marriage to a sacred institution distinct from mere carnal indulgence. Sermons and theological treatises sometimes discussed the virtues of chastity, not just for virgins, but also for married couples, which meant fidelity and moderation. But this did not mean the absence of physical affection or relations. Instead, it meant exercising self-control and directing intimacy towards its God-given purposes within the sacred bond. Looking at popular literature and poetry from the period, while often secular in nature, some religious works also acknowledge the complexity of human love. Although spiritual love was always prioritized, the existence of earthly love was not entirely ignored. Courtly love, though distinct from the church's view of marriage, often involved a different kind of idealization of the beloved, sometimes in ways that could be seen as challenging church norms, but even within its framework, physical desire was often present, albeit sublimated or expressed in highly stylized ways. This illustrates the broader societal conversation around love and desire, of which the church's teachings formed one important, but not the only, part. The celebration of saints also provides insight. While virgin martyrs like Agnes or Cecilia were revered for their steadfast purity, married saints were also honored. Saint Elizabeth of Hungary, a queen and mother of several children, was venerated for her piety, charity, and devotion, all while being a wife and mother within a traditional marriage. Her sanctity was not diminished by her married state or the fact of her children, but rather her holiness was seen as expressed through her fulfillment of those roles within the sacrament of marriage. This shows that the church's ideal for women was not limited to cloistered virginity but encompassed the married life as well, recognizing its own spiritual merits and its proper place for human intimacy. The church, while emphasizing the spiritual, also recognized the realities of human nature and the sacrament of marriage as a divinely ordained institution that encompassed the physical union of man and woman. Number 6. Women were excluded from religious life and roles. A common belief suggests that medieval women were pushed to the edges of religious life, with no real active roles beyond passive piety or domestic devotion. People sometimes think that the church, being a male-dominated institution, kept women from any position of influence or spiritual authority. This often leads to a picture where women were only allowed to pray at home, or perhaps join a strict convent where they had little say in anything. The idea is that the spiritual path for women was narrow and confined, lacking the vibrant and diverse opportunities available to men. However, historical records tell a much more complex and active story about women's involvement in the spiritual landscape of the Middle Ages. Women were not merely passive recipients of faith, they were active participants, leaders, thinkers, and innovators within the church's vast sphere. They carved out roles for themselves, often with the church's blessing, and sometimes even through its institutional structures. One of the most prominent examples of female leadership within the church was the role of the abbess. Abbesses were powerful figures who governed large monastic communities of women. These communities, often wealthy and influential, sometimes owned vast estates, controlled significant resources, and administered justice over their lands and tenants. An abbess like Hildegard of Bingen in 12th century Germany was not only a renowned mystic and visionary, but also the head of her own monastery, Rupertsberg. She managed its finances, disciplined her nuns, and oversaw its intellectual and spiritual life. She corresponded with popes, emperors, and kings, offering spiritual advice and even political commentary. Her authority within her monastic context was substantial, encompassing spiritual direction, economic administration, and social influence. She founded new monasteries, negotiated land deals, and protected her community's independence. Another powerful abbess was Heloise, the famous correspondent of Peter Abelard in the 12th century. After her monastic vows, she became abbess of the Pericles Oratory. She demonstrated remarkable administrative skill and spiritual depth in leading her community. She oversaw the material well-being of the nuns, managed their lands, and was responsible for their spiritual guidance and intellectual pursuits. Her influence extended beyond her convent walls, through her extensive correspondence and the reputation of her community. Female mystics and visionaries also held immense spiritual authority. These women experienced direct communion with God, perceiving visions, hearing divine voices, and receiving prophetic messages. Their experiences were often recorded, sometimes by scribes, and circulated widely, influencing theological thought and popular devotion. Catherine of Siena in the 14th century was a lay Dominican who had profound mystical experiences. She traveled throughout Italy, advising popes, mediating political disputes, and advocating for church reform. She wrote extensively, dictating letters and treatises that expressed her deep theological insights. Her influence was so significant that she became a doctor of the church, a rare honor bestowed only on a select few, recognizing their profound theological contributions. Another example is Bridget of Sweden, a 14th century noblewoman, mother, and mystic. After her husband's death, she founded the Brigittine order, a double monastery for both men and women, with the abbess holding overall authority. Her spiritual revelations were highly influential, and she undertook pilgrimages and political missions, addressing rulers and religious leaders. Her foundation, the Brigittine order, was formally recognized by the church, establishing a new monastic structure where women held a uniquely prominent position in its governance. Anchoresses, women who chose to live in solitary confinement in a small cell attached to a church, also played a significant religious role. Though physically enclosed, they were not cut off from the spiritual life of the community. People would visit them for spiritual advice, confession, and prayer. Julian of Norwich, a 14th century anchoress, received profound mystical revelations during an illness. She spent decades meditating on these visions, eventually writing the first book in English, known to have been written by a woman, Revelations of Divine Love. Her deep theological reflections on God's love and mercy continue to inspire readers centuries later, demonstrating her intellectual and spiritual impact from within a life of enclosure. Beyond these more formal roles, women were deeply involved in the daily religious life of their communities. They participated in parish life, attended Mass, received sacraments, and engaged in private devotion. Women formed confraternities and guilds, which were religious associations dedicated to specific saints or charitable works. These groups allowed women to organize, pool resources, and collectively engage in acts of piety and social support, sometimes commissioning artworks or providing burial services for their members. In Beguines, a movement of lay religious women that emerged in the 12th century, especially in the Low Countries, also illustrate the diversity of female religious expression. These women lived together in communities without taking formal vows, dedicating themselves to a life of prayer, contemplation, and charitable work, but without the strict enclosure of convents. They supported themselves through various crafts like weaving or spinning. The Beguines offered a flexible alternative for women who desired a religious life but did not wish to enter traditional monastic orders. They engaged in teaching, nursing, and caring for the poor, demonstrating active roles in society while living a devout life. Despite initial suspicion from some church authorities, the Beguine movement flourished for centuries, highlighting the church's eventual accommodation of varied female spiritual paths. Even in more traditional lay contexts, women played essential roles in passing on religious knowledge and practices within the family. Mothers were often the primary instructors of faith for their children, teaching prayers, Bible stories, and moral precepts. They shaped the religious landscape of the domestic sphere, influencing future generations of believers. This informal yet foundational role was crucial for the transmission of Christian culture. These examples reveal that medieval women found numerous avenues for spiritual expression, leadership, and intellectual engagement within and alongside the structures of the church. Their contributions were diverse, influential, and deeply woven into the religious tapestry of the Middle Ages, contradicting any idea of universal exclusion. Number 5. The church suppressed all female learning and literacy. A common notion suggests that during the Middle Ages, the church actively worked to keep women uneducated, discouraging their literacy and intellectual pursuits. People often picture a time when books were only for men, especially male clergy, and that women were confined to domestic duties with no access to formal learning. This widespread belief paints a picture of deliberate suppression, where the church intentionally limited women's minds to keep them from challenging established norms or gaining any form of intellectual independence. It is sometimes thought that the church's doctrines, based on traditional interpretations, inherently prevented women from engaging with scholarly texts or contributing to the intellectual life of the period. However, historical records tell a different and much more nuanced story. While universal literacy for both men and women was not common in the Middle Ages, particularly in the early centuries, the church, especially through its monastic institutions, provided significant opportunities for female learning and even scholarship. Convents were centers of learning, serving as places where women could not only become literate, but also engage deeply with texts, write their own works, and contribute to the intellectual life of the period. Within convents, nuns were required to read and understand the divine office, the daily prayers, and scripture readings. This necessity meant that basic literacy in Latin, the language of the church, was fundamental for many nuns. Beyond this, many convents maintained libraries, sometimes quite extensive, filled with religious texts, theological treatises, philosophical works, and even classical literature. These libraries were resources for study and contemplation. For example, the Abbey of Gandersheim in 10th century Saxony was home to Roswitha, a canoness, who was a remarkable dramatist and poet. She wrote Latin plays modeled on Terence, but with Christian themes, making her the first known female dramatist in Western Europe. She also composed historical narratives and poems, demonstrating a profound classical education and intellectual prowess within her monastic setting. Her works were recognized and circulated, showing that her learning was not suppressed but celebrated in some circles. Another significant figure was Herad of Landsberg, a 12th century abbess of Hohenberg Abbey in Alsace. She oversaw the creation of the Hortus Deliciarum Garden of Delights, an illuminated encyclopedia covering theology, philosophy, history, and natural sciences. This massive work was intended as a teaching tool for the nuns in her community. It contained over 1,100 Latin verses and 336 illustrations, many of which she likely designed herself. The Hortus Deliciarum stands as a testament to the comprehensive education available to women in certain convents and the intellectual ambition of female leaders like Herad. Hildegard of Bingen, mentioned before as an abbess and mystic, was also a formidable intellectual figure. She wrote theological treatises, scientific works, including texts on medicine and natural history, and composed liturgical music. Her writings were deeply learned, drawing on scriptural knowledge, theological concepts, and philosophical ideas. She corresponded with leading figures of her time, including popes and emperors, who often sought her spiritual counsel and insights. Her works were copied and disseminated, indicating that her intellectual contributions were valued. Beyond the cloister, while less common, some aristocratic women received education, often through private tutors or within noble households. Queens and noble women needed to manage large estates, oversee finances, and participate in courtly life, which often required literacy and numeracy. Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women of the 12th century, was a patron of literature and culture. Her court was a center of intellectual activity and poetic creation. While her personal education details are sparse, her actions suggest a woman who understood and appreciated intellectual pursuits, fostering an environment where literary works flourished. Some women also participated in the vibrant literary culture of the medieval courts. Marie de France, a 12th century French poet, was one of the earliest known female French writers. She wrote a collection of narrative poems known as Lais, exploring themes of love, chivalry, and adventure. Her sophisticated use of language and narrative structure indicates a high level of literary skill and education. Her works were popular and widely copied, showcasing a female voice actively shaping contemporary literature. Even for laywomen, while formal schooling was rare, informal literacy could be acquired. Women in merchant families, for instance, might learn basic reading and writing to help with household accounts or business correspondence. Wealthy urban women might have access to books of hours, illuminated prayer books that were widely used for private devotion. These books often contained beautiful illustrations and devotional texts, providing a personal connection to literacy and religious thought. The existence of these personal prayer books, many commissioned by or for women, suggests a demand for and engagement with written materials among at least the wealthier female population. The Church, through its emphasis on personal piety and the reading of Scripture, also inadvertently encouraged literacy among some women. Devotional texts, lives of saints, and spiritual guides were translated into vernacular languages, making them accessible to a broader audience, including women who might not have learned Latin. Marjorie Kempe, a 15th century English mystic, dictated her autobiography, The Book of Marjorie Kempe, making her the first known autobiographer in English. Though she herself was likely illiterate, her decision to dictate her experiences and the act of a scribe recording them speaks to a culture where women's spiritual narratives were considered important enough to be written down and preserved, suggesting an audience for such works, possibly including other women. While the paths to learning were different for men and women, and opportunities varied by social class and geographic region, the idea of a universal church-led suppression of female literacy does not align with the historical evidence. Instead, the Church, particularly through its monastic institutions, provided some of the most significant and consistent opportunities for medieval women to pursue intellectual and literary endeavors, demonstrating a far more complex relationship between faith and female learning than often portrayed. Number 4. All women were forced into marriage or convents. A widespread idea suggests that medieval women faced only two choices for their lives. Either they were compelled into an arranged marriage, often at a young age, or they were sent away to a convent, with little to no say in their own destiny. This belief paints a picture of medieval society as a place where women had no personal freedom, no autonomy, and no alternative paths available to them. It is sometimes thought that societal pressure and church teachings rigidly enforce these two options, leaving no room for women to choose a different way of life. The implication is that if a woman did not fit neatly into one of these categories, she simply had no recognized place in the world. However, historical realities reveal a much broader spectrum of choices and circumstances for medieval women, showing that their lives were far more diverse than this limited view implies. While marriage and convent life were indeed common and important paths, they were not the only ones, and the agency women exercised in navigating these choices was often significant. Many women, for various reasons, remained single throughout their lives without entering a convent. These unmarried women, sometimes called spinsters, or single women, often played vital roles in their communities and families. They might work to support themselves, inheriting property, or engaging in various trades. In towns and cities, women worked in a wide array of occupations. They could be brewers, bakers, textile workers, shopkeepers, innkeepers, or even run their own businesses. Guild records from various cities like London or Paris show women as members of guilds, sometimes as widows, taking over their deceased husbands' businesses, but also as independent craftswomen. For example, in 13th century Paris, ordinances listed various trades open to women, including silk weavers, embroiderers, and makers of purses. These women often lived independently or with family, contributing economically and maintaining a social presence outside of marital or monastic structures. Widowhood also presented a distinct path for women, often granting them a degree of independence they might not have had during their marriage. Upon their husband's death, widows often regained control over their dowry and dower, a portion of her husband's property set aside for her use, giving them financial autonomy. They could choose whether to remarry, often having more say in a second marriage than in their first. Many widows chose not to remarry, preferring to manage their inherited estates, raise their children, or oversee family businesses. Powerful noblewomen like Blanche of Castile, after the death of her husband, King Louis VIII of France, served as regent for her son, Louis IX, demonstrating immense political power and administrative skill. She ruled France effectively for many years, making crucial decisions of state, negotiating treaties, and defending the kingdom, all while remaining a widow. This powerful example shows a woman exercising significant authority outside of the direct influence of a living husband. The Beguines previously mentioned represent another significant alternative. These women chose a semi-religious life, living in communities, beguinages, but without taking permanent vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience like nuns. They were free to leave the community and marry if they wished, though many dedicated their lives to spiritual pursuits and charitable work. They supported themselves through their labor, often in weaving or textile production. The Beguine movement flourished across Northern Europe, particularly in present-day Belgium, the Netherlands, and Germany, offering thousands of women a recognized and respected way of life that was neither married nor fully cloistered. Marguerite Porete, a Beguine in the late 13th century, wrote The Mirror of Simple Souls, a mystical text that explored the soul's journey to union with God. Her life as a Beguine allowed her the intellectual space and spiritual freedom to produce such a profound theological work, though she faced persecution for her views later on. Some women also chose lives as hermits or anchoresses, dedicating themselves to solitude and prayer outside of formal monastic structures. While anchoresses were usually enclosed, their choice was often deeply personal and their spiritual independence notable. This path was chosen, not forced, and was seen as a highly esteemed form of piety, granting these women a unique spiritual authority within their local communities. Even for women entering convents, the idea of being forced is often an oversimplification. While some daughters of noble families might have been placed in convents for practical reasons, e.g., to avoid splitting inheritances among too many heirs or to ensure an honorable future for girls whose dowries were insufficient for a good marriage, many women chose convent life out of genuine religious calling, intellectual curiosity, or a desire for an educated and sheltered environment. Convents offered opportunities for learning, spiritual development, and leadership that were often unavailable to women in the secular world. Women like Hildegard of Bingen actively sought out and embraced monastic life, finding in it a path to spiritual and intellectual fulfillment. The choice to enter a convent could be a pathway to personal agency and a degree of freedom from patriarchal control often found in marriage. The Church's legal system also gave women some protections and a voice in their marital choices. The canon law, which governed marriage, required the free consent of both parties for a marriage to be valid. While parental pressure was certainly common, the Church's courts would uphold a woman's right to refuse a marriage, even if it meant defying her family. There are records of women appealing to church courts to annul marriages where their consent was not freely given or where they were forced. This legal requirement, though not always perfectly enforced, represented a significant acknowledgement of a woman's individual will in a key life decision. These diverse examples show that medieval women had more agency and more options than the simple marriage or convent narrative allows. Their lives were shaped by economic realities, social norms, family expectations, and personal desires, leading to a varied tapestry of experiences that included independent work, widowhood, semi-religious communities, solitary devotion, and voluntary religious commitment, all alongside the widespread paths of marriage and traditional monasticism. Number 3, marriage was always oppressive, and women had no rights within it. A common view suggests that medieval marriage was a uniformly oppressive institution for women, where they were treated as mere property, had no voice, and possessed no legal or personal rights within the marital bond. This often conjures images of women being entirely subjected to their husband's will, with no recourse or protection under the law or by the church. It is frequently assumed that once a woman married, her legal identity was entirely absorbed by her husband's, leaving her without any individual standing or control over her life or possessions. However, historical evidence, particularly from the perspective of canon law and various regional legal traditions, reveals a far more complex reality. While medieval marriage certainly operated within a patriarchal framework, women did possess specific rights, protections, and avenues of legal recourse within it, often upheld by the church's judicial system. One of the most significant rights for women in medieval marriage, as established by canon law, was the requirement of free consent. For a marriage to be valid in the eyes of the church, both the man and the woman had to freely agree to it. This meant that forced marriages, where a woman was coerced or physically compelled into a union against her will, could be annulled by church courts. There are documented cases where women successfully appealed to these courts, testifying that their consent was not freely given. For instance, a woman might argue that she was pressured by her family or physically threatened. If the church court found sufficient evidence of coercion, the marriage could be declared null and void, meaning it was treated as if it never legally existed. This legal principle, though sometimes difficult to enforce against powerful families, provided a crucial safeguard for a woman's bodily autonomy and personal choice in forming the most fundamental social bond. Property rights for married women varied significantly across different regions of medieval Europe, but they were not universally non-existent. In some areas, particularly parts of northern France and England, dower and dowry systems offered women some financial security and control. The dower was a portion of the husband's estate, often 1/3, that was set aside for the wife's maintenance, should she become a widow. This was a legal right that could not be easily denied. The dowry, conversely, was property or money that the bride brought into the marriage, often from her own family. While the husband typically managed the dowry during the marriage, in many regions it was understood that this property remained technically hers and would revert to her or her family upon the husband's death, or if the marriage was annulled. In some Germanic legal traditions, women maintained even greater control over their own property, keeping their premarital assets separate from their husbands. These arrangements, though diverse, demonstrate that women were not always stripped of all economic standing upon marriage. The church also provided grounds for annulment or separation, though not divorce in the modern sense, which allowed remarriage that women could pursue. All these grounds included things like consanguinity being too closely related by blood, pre-existing vows, impotence of the husband, or lack of free consent. A woman could bring a case before an ecclesiastical court if she believed her marriage was invalid on these grounds. While these processes could be lengthy and costly, they represented a legal avenue for women seeking to escape an unworkable or illegitimate union, showing that marriage was not an unbreakable prison without any form of legal exit. Wife beating, while tragically common and often tolerated by societal norms, was not always explicitly sanctioned by the church without limits. Some theological and legal texts did condemn excessive or cruel violence against wives. While these condemnations were often qualified and did not always lead to immediate legal action, they show that the church did not universally endorse unlimited domestic violence. Preachers sometimes urged husbands to treat their wives with kindness and respect, drawing parallels to Christ's love for the church. The church's ideal of marriage, though hierarchical, was also based on mutual support and fidelity, not simply brute force. And furthermore, within the household, medieval wives often had considerable practical authority, particularly in managing domestic affairs, overseeing servants, and raising children. For peasant women, they worked alongside their husbands in the fields and managed the household economy, contributing vital labor. For noble women, managing a large estate, its tenants, and its finances while their husbands were away at war or on other duties was a common and demanding responsibility, demonstrating significant administrative and economic power within their domain. These practical roles, though not always formalized as rights, granted women substantial influence and decision-making power within their daily lives. The concept of the debt of conjugal or marital debt also implies a mutual obligation. While often discussed in terms of a husband's right to sexual relations, it also sometimes implied a wife's right to the same, or at least a recognition of mutual duties within the marital bond. Refusal to fulfill this debt without just cause could be grounds for legal complaint from either spouse, highlighting a reciprocal understanding of marital obligations, even if unequal in practice. While a wife's legal identity was often subsumed under her husband's during the marriage, particularly in common law systems, this was not absolute. Women could still inherit property, including land, and pass it on to their children. Widows, as mentioned, often regained significant legal and economic independence, controlling their own affairs and property. This demonstrates that the concept of a woman's legal identity was not entirely erased, but rather suspended or modified during marriage, with the potential for it to reemerge, especially in widowhood. The reality of medieval marriage for women was varied, influenced by class, region, and individual circumstances. While the patriarchal structure was undeniable, the church, through its canon law and courts and various local legal customs, provided women with significant rights and protections, particularly regarding consent and property, making the blanket statement of total oppression an oversimplification of a complex historical institution. Number 2. Women had no power or agency. A widely held belief suggests that medieval women were entirely powerless, passive figures with no ability to make decisions, exert influence, or shape their own lives or the world around them. This often leads to a picture of women being completely controlled by their fathers, then their husbands, and having no voice in public affairs, economic matters, or even their personal destinies. The idea is that their lives were solely confined to the domestic sphere, with no opportunities for leadership, independent action, or meaningful contribution beyond childbearing and household chores. However, historical records are filled with examples of medieval women who exercised significant power, agency, and influence in diverse areas of society, challenging this simplified view. Women were not a monolithic group, and their experiences varied greatly by social class, family status, religious affiliation, and individual personality. As previously mentioned, abbesses were immensely powerful figures within the church. They governed large monastic communities, managed extensive land holdings, controlled significant financial resources, and often administered justice over the people living on their estates. An abbess, like Mathilda of Quedlinburg, a 10th century abbess, acted as a powerful regent for her nephew, Emperor Otto III, during his minority. She presided over imperial diets, which were assemblies of the Holy Roman Empire, and played a crucial role in political affairs. Her authority stemmed from her position as an abbess, but it extended far beyond the cloister, demonstrating political and administrative power typically associated with male rulers. And queens and noble women also wielded considerable political power, especially as regents for underage sons or absent husbands, or through their own inherited titles. Eleanor of Aquitaine, in the 12th century, was a powerful duchess in her own right, inheriting vast territories in southwestern France. She was queen consort of France and later of England. She led crusades, negotiated political alliances, advised her husbands, and even played a role in rebellions. Her influence on the political and cultural landscape of her time was immense, directly impacting dynastic lines and the course of kingdoms. Another example is Isabella of France, a 14th century queen consort of England, who famously led an invasion to depose her husband, Edward II, and ruled as regent for her son, Edward III. These women were not mere symbols, they were active political players who shaped events. Beyond the ruling elites, women in urban areas actively participated in economic life. They ran businesses, managed shops, and were involved in various trades. Guild records from cities like London, Florence, and Cologne show women as active members, sometimes inheriting their husbands' businesses as widows and continuing to run them successfully. Her women worked as brewers, bakers, milliners, goldsmiths, and textile workers. They engaged in commerce, buying and selling goods in markets. Some women were wealthy merchants in their own right, investing in trade and accumulating significant capital. These women, through their economic activities, gained a degree of financial independence and influence within their communities, managing their own affairs and making significant contributions to the urban economy. In rural settings, peasant women were essential to the agricultural economy, working alongside men in the fields, managing livestock, and contributing to household production. Their labor was vital for the survival of their families and communities. While their work was often physically demanding and less visible in historical records than that of the elite, their agency in the daily survival and functioning of agrarian society was undeniable. They made decisions about food production, resource management, and the welfare of their families. Women also exerted agency through their spiritual lives. Female mystics, visionaries, and saints, as explored earlier, held immense spiritual authority. Figures like Catherine of Siena not only experienced profound religious visions, but also used their spiritual prestige to influence popes and political leaders, intervening in major church and state affairs. Their voices, understood as divinely inspired, carried significant weight and could challenge secular and ecclesiastical authorities. This was a form of power derived from religious devotion and perceived direct connection to the divine. Even within the domestic sphere, women often held significant authority. The lady of a manor, for instance, was responsible for the management of the household, which could include dozens or even hundreds of servants. She oversaw food production, clothing, healthcare, and the education of children. This required considerable organizational skills, financial management, and leadership. These women exercised control over a large domain and a considerable number of people, making decisions that directly impacted the daily lives of many. Women also acted as patrons of art, architecture, and literature. They commissioned illuminated manuscripts, built chapels, and supported writers and artists. This patronage allowed them to shape cultural production and express their own tastes and values. For example, Isabella of France commissioned a variety of artistic and literary works during her regency, using them to project her image and legitimize her rule. Furthermore, women influenced society through informal networks and personal relationships. Queens, noblewomen, and even women of lower status often formed alliances, exchanged information, and exerted influence through their social connections. They could intercede on behalf of others, offer advice, and subtly shape public opinion through their networks of kin and friends. These informal channels of power were often crucial in medieval society and were certainly accessible to women. These numerous examples demonstrate that medieval women were far from universally powerless or without agency. Their lives were dynamic and varied, with many women actively participating in, leading, and shaping their societies in political, economic, spiritual, and cultural realms, often challenging the boundaries of their prescribed roles. Number 1. Women were always seen as inherently evil or inferior due to Eve. A very strong and persistent idea is that the medieval church consistently viewed all women as inherently evil, weak, or fundamentally inferior to men, primarily because of the biblical story of Eve and her temptation in the Garden of Eden. This belief often leads to the conclusion that medieval theology and popular sentiment blamed women for humanity's fall, casting a perpetual shadow of sin and suspicion over their very nature. People sometimes think that this Eve complex was the sole lens through which the church saw women, leading to their universal subjugation and demonization throughout the Middle Ages. It is often portrayed as if Eve's sin defined all women for centuries, making them inherently untrustworthy and morally corrupt in the eyes of the church. However, a close examination of medieval theological thought, devotional practices, and the veneration of saints reveals a far more complex and often contradictory picture. While the story of Eve certainly played a role in some interpretations and sermons, it was never the only, nor necessarily the dominant theological framework for understanding women. The church held multiple, sometimes conflicting, views on female nature and women's spiritual capacity. The figure of the Virgin Mary stands in stark contrast to Eve, and was arguably far more influential in shaping popular piety and theological discourse about women. Mary was seen as the new Eve, whose obedience and purity redeemed Eve's disobedience. She was revered as the Mother of God, the Queen of Heaven, and a powerful intercessor for humanity. Devotion to Mary permeated medieval society, inspiring countless prayers, hymns, artworks, and cathedrals. She was the embodiment of virtue, humility, and maternal love. The exaltation of Mary provided a powerful counter-narrative to any simplistic condemnation of female nature. Her elevated status showed that women could achieve the highest levels of holiness and proximity to the divine. Nuns often saw themselves as brides of Christ, modeling their lives on Mary's purity and devotion. Furthermore, medieval theologians, while acknowledging Eve's sin, also emphasized the concept of the soul. Christian theology taught that both men and women possessed rational souls created in the image of God. In the eyes of God, the soul was considered genderless and equally capable of spiritual perfection. This fundamental equality of the soul meant that women, like men, could achieve salvation, spiritual enlightenment, and even sainthood. Thomas Aquinas, a highly influential theologian of the 13th century, affirmed that both men and women were equally capable of receiving God's grace and achieving salvation, as grace works on the soul, not the body's gender. The widespread veneration of female saints also directly contradicts the idea of women being universally seen as evil or inferior. Thousands of women were canonized as saints throughout the Middle Ages, revered for their piety, charity, courage, and spiritual wisdom. These included virgin martyrs like Saint Agnes, intellectual figures like Saint Hildegard of Bingen, queens like Saint Elizabeth of Hungary, and mystics like Saint Catherine of Siena. These women were held up as models of Christian living, their lives inspiring countless faithful. Their stories, often recorded in hagiography saints' lives, emphasize their virtues, their spiritual strength, and their divine favor. The existence of so many female saints demonstrates that the Church certainly believed women were capable of extreme holiness and spiritual excellence, serving as guides and protectors for the faithful. By religious orders for women, such as Benedictine, Cistercian, Dominican, and Franciscan nuns, offered women a respected and honorable path to spiritual devotion and intellectual life. Women who entered these orders dedicated their lives to God, pursuing lives of prayer, study, and charitable work. The very existence and proliferation of these convents, often supported and encouraged by church authorities, shows that there was a recognized and valued place for women in formalized religious life, often as leaders and scholars within their communities, not as inherently flawed beings. Beyond formal theology, medieval popular culture and literature also presented varied portrayals of women. While some narratives might reinforce traditional stereotypes, many others depicted women in complex roles as devoted wives and mothers, wise counselors, valiant heroines, and strong rulers. Medieval romances, for example, often featured strong, intelligent, and capable female characters who played crucial roles in the narrative, even if within the confines of chivalric ideals. Even within the context of marriage, while the Church often emphasized a husband's authority, it also stressed the virtues of mutuality, fidelity, and companionship. Marriage was seen as a sacrament, a holy union blessed by God, not merely a necessary evil to control sinful women. The theological understanding of marriage as a reflection of Christ's relationship with the Church bestowed upon it a sacred dignity that elevated the roles of both spouses within it. The emphasis on Eve's sin was often used to teach about the dangers of temptation, disobedience, and pride for all humanity, not exclusively to condemn women. While women were sometimes linked more directly to Eve, it was also part of a broader discussion about original sin and the human condition. Medieval sermons often preached about the need for repentance and redemption for everyone, male and female, based on the shared human fallen nature, not solely on a woman's inherent depravity. The idea that the Church held a monolithic, universally negative view of women is an oversimplification. While some misogynistic views existed, as they did in wider society, the dominant theological and devotional currents offered powerful counter-narratives of female spiritual equality, sanctity, and honor, primarily through the veneration of Mary and the multitude of female saints, and the recognition of the soul's inherent worth in both genders. The medieval world was a place of complex ideas, where the narrative of Eve coexisted with the glorification of Mary, and where the perceived weaknesses of the flesh were balanced by the spiritual potential of all souls.